kind of interesting to be starting football here in March, especially when be able to get the pads. But exciting, good to get going, and like I said, appreciate the turnout. We got a lot of work to do, a long way to go.
Hello and welcome to Always College Football. I'm your host, Greg McElroy. Today is Thursday, March 6th, and we hope that you're enjoying the show wherever it is that you're consuming the show. On Spotify, Apple Podcast, ESPN College Football YouTube channel. All of that is great. Wherever you get the show, we hope you're enjoying it. It's been honestly a pretty exciting offseason so far. I look at just the playing field across the game, from the best team in the country to the worst Power 5 team in the country, and it feels like the gap might be closer than ever. Those of you that are fans of Purdue might not feel that way, and those of you that are fans of Ohio State who won the national championship might think the gap is massive. I happen to think that this year upcoming is going to be really intriguing, and if there's one thing that we learned from last year, it's that teams like Indiana, teams like SMU, teams that have not traditionally been in the mix for a college football playoff spot now have access with the landscape changes that we've seen in the sport. So very excited about this offseason. And the more I dive into these teams, the more I'm starting to think, man, we're going to have some chaos this upcoming season. We have a lot of news that's also come out here over the last week or so. We want to dive into some of those stories. Some are more interesting than others, and others I think we can spin into a conversation about that team. We'll talk some Wisconsin. We'll talk some giant killers and some teams that are going to be around 500, maybe slightly better, that can be a huge problem for teams that have championship aspirations. We're going to talk about Bill Belichick. As you can see, for those of you that saw a moment ago, we're going to get into some Bill Belichick discussion. What can North Carolina do? What are some priorities for them heading into the spring? What are the big things that need to be ironed out as Bill Belichick makes a ridiculous transition from the NFL and a 6-time Super Bowl winner to a first-time college football head coach? And then we'll also go to the mailbag, where we have a handful of your questions, including a question that centers around the SEC and the best defense in the league. So let's dive in. Let's not mess around. Let's talk a little bit about the Badgers of Wisconsin. We'll start with the news for the Badgers. Their opener against Miami, Ohio, has officially been moved up to Thursday night. They have opened in a primetime matchup multiple times, and this is not new. Do we care that much about moving from Saturday or Friday to Thursday or changing the schedule? Not really. That's not why we're talking about Wisconsin today. It's news, but it allows us to get into year 3 of what we can expect from Luke Fickell's Badgers. You look at last year, Wisconsin was a very unique team. There were moments where you watched them and you're like, all right, this team's they're very dangerous. They're a problem. Like we saw against Penn State, like we saw at home against Oregon. And then we saw other points in the season in which you're like, golly, what happened to Wisconsin? The gap in performance that we saw in year 2 was pretty massive. Now, they had to endure a few challenging moments, right? Losing Tyler Van Dyke early in the season against Alabama kind of disrupted what they might be able to be offensively. They also have a really difficult schedule. That didn't help whatsoever, but I am more optimistic this year about Wisconsin because I really believe in what they've decided to become offensively. It all starts for me when evaluating the Badgers with the hire of Jeff Grimes. He's the new offensive coordinator. He is a 2-time finalist for the Frank Broyles Award, which goes annually to the nation's top assistant coach. Now, both these occurrences where he was a finalist was in 2020 and 2021, but I think you could have made the case that he probably should have won it in both those years. He was that good. He's most recently been at Kansas, but he spent time at both Baylor and at BYU before that. But at Kansas, they've had an offense that ranked in the top 12 nationally on a team that won just 5 games, a team that ran the ball for over 212 rushing yards a game. They averaged over 5.5 yards a carry. And when I think Wisconsin, I don't think spread power. right? I think about I formation, 2 tight ends, Ron Dane. I think about I formation, maybe 1 tight end, Melvin Gordon. I don't think about spread power. I think about one-cut runners and massive offensive lines. I mean, in Wisconsin's heyday, at the best version of Wisconsin, the Rose Bowl winning Wisconsin, that's the style of attack that they utilized. And Jeff Grimes has used that style in the past. Now, he's not going to be as traditional as Wisconsin once was. It's not going to happen. But I do think the commitment to running the football, utilizing under center, utilizing a stretch zone style of attack that creates a lot of problems for the opposing defense is going to be super beneficial to morphing Wisconsin back into the offense that they once were. Now, I, for one, thought it was going to be great with what they did a couple years ago when they decided to go out and hire Phil Longo. I was really optimistic about Wisconsin a couple years back. I'm like, man, this offense, what was once archaic, they're now going to implement a new style spread. It didn't work. It's not who Wisconsin is. It's not what Wisconsin fans are expecting when they watch their offense. So I'm very optimistic about this hire. I think Jeff Grimes is a simple system, one that is very easy on the offense, but also extremely difficult on the defense to defend. I also look at their quarterback addition in the portal this year. Billy Edwards, he transfers over, fifth-year senior. He was at Maryland last year. And I think it's interesting because when I think of Billy Edwards, who, by the way, I think has a lot of talent, and I think a lot of people wanted Billy Edwards to be their quarterback, but Billy Edwards, based on what he did at Maryland and the style of offense that he played in, he would have been really well suited to transfer to Wisconsin running the Phil Longo style offense. A very heavy on RPOs, a lot of spread, traditional drop back. I mean, that's what he ran at Maryland under Mike Loxley. Now he's going to be asked to become a little bit more pro style with his approach. But I like the skill set that Billy Edwards brings and the experience that he brings to Madison to run this new style of attack. But the big problems on Wisconsin last year was a defense that was pretty dang inconsistent. There were major flashes of potential, but there were also 3 games in which they allowed 40-plus points. What's even more troubling when watching Wisconsin, they've always been a team that's extremely stout against the run. Well, they gave up 165 rushing yards a game. That was their worst performance as a run defense in almost 20 years. It'd been a long, long time we've seen a group struggle against the run or stopping the run like the Badgers had last year. They know they needed to be more effective in that area. They knew they had to commit to that. And the only way they're going to do that is by overhauling their personnel along the D line and then bringing in some new players at the linebacker and the second level. So I'm pretty optimistic with the new pieces they've added, but we'll see if it's going to work because the schedule is extremely interesting. You go on September 13th to Alabama. Alabama got the best of you last year. It will be Alabama's first real test of the season, depending on how you view the Florida State game. So Alabama might be pretty battle tested at that point, relatively speaking. Wisconsin, on the other hand, should go into that game relatively fresh and should have a couple tricks up their sleeve, knowing they do have a new offense with Jeff Grimes that Alabama will have to be preparing for. They have Iowa on October 11th, and any Wisconsin fan knows that that game is going to set the tone for the remainder of the season. So, yeah, first 5-6 weeks, they should be in pretty good shape. You lose to Iowa, we know that that can potentially spell doom for what Wisconsin might become later in the year. But think about this 3-game stretch. On October 11th, you got Iowa. That's at home, at least, so that's a win. On October 18th, you got Ohio State. Now, Wisconsin has not beaten Ohio State since 2010. The last time they played, they lost 24-10 in Madison 2 years ago. So it's been a while since the Badgers have knocked off the Buckeyes, but they do get them at home. The problem is it's the week after Iowa. And then after you play Ohio State, hey, guess what? That 2-game stretch wasn't hard enough. Let's now go to Eugene, where we have to take on one of the best programs in the country on October 25th. Now, Wisconsin and Oregon have played each other a bunch, most of which in Rose Bowls. But almost every time they play, it seems like it's a game that comes down to the wire, including the game last year where Oregon played probably the toughest game in the regular season they had to play outside of the game against Ohio State was at Wisconsin. So we'll see how that goes. And then finally, they'll finish things up at Minnesota on November 29th. So a very interesting season, but reason for optimism for me with the new additions defensively, the new style they're going to attack people with offensively, and a new quarterback in Billy Edwards, who I'm pretty optimistic about. Moving down south just a little bit more, we'll go to Nashville. We'll now talk about the Vanderbilt Commodores. Raise your hand if you thought we on Always College Football were going to be talking about Vanderbilt on March 6th. I didn't expect it. I programmed the show alongside my good friend Mark Kubiak. We never thought that we'd be talking about Vandy here in March, but when Vandy goes to a bowl game, when Vandy wins the bowl game, when Vandy is a major giant killer, guess what? They're going to get some attention here in the spring. But we're not going to talk about Vandy outside of the fact that they promoted Steve Gregory to defensive coordinator. The new DC now allows Clark Lee, who served in that capacity last year, to focus exclusively on his head coaching responsibilities. So that's big. They have now also added Bob Shoop, formerly of Penn State, and then formerly of Vanderbilt. He was the defensive coordinator there under James Franklin. He'll be a senior defensive analyst and will only add to the support that Steve Gregory will receive. Remember, Vanderbilt last year, they knocked off Alabama. That was a significant breakthrough moment, knocking off the number one team in the country. And the reason why they did that is because Diego Pavia was off the charts good in that game. He got a very favorable court ruling that allowed him to return this upcoming year. He was out of eligibility, but he went and hired a lawyer. They fought that his JUCO year that he spent prior to New Mexico State doesn't count towards his eligibility. He won that ruling, and he now gets to return. They have one of the best tight ends in the country in Eli Stowers, and I think this is a Vanderbilt team that can be a huge spoiler this upcoming season. No one expects Vanderbilt to contend for the SEC. I don't think anyone expects Vanderbilt to contend for the college football playoff or anything like that, but Vanderbilt can very easily knock off teams that have aspirations of making the college football playoff. If Bama beats Vanderbilt last year, does Bama make the playoff? Yes, I think they do. There are probably a few others that Vandy knocked off last year, Vandy made close, that could have had potentially, if not for losing to Vandy, could have had some possible playoff hopes down the road as well. So it got us thinking, who are some teams that are going to play the giant killer role this year? Now, giant killers are teams that I look at and that lost half their games in the regular season thereabouts, but can knock off anybody. Now, in some cases, we're going to discuss these here today, teams that really nobody's talking about, but they're not really a team you want to play, especially when taking into account some of the returning production and the progress that they're expecting to make on one side of the ball. So here's some giant killers from Always College Football. These teams are on your schedule. You need to be very, very careful because these will not be championship contenders, but they are problems. Number one, the Michigan State Spartans. They returned 63% of their returning production. And the big thing that they need to do is improve on the offensive side of the football. They struggled last year. They struggled badly. They had more than 19 points just 2 times in their final 9 games. They finished 110th in the country in run game. It's not what you want, right? At all. But I also think back, why did Jonathan Smith get the Michigan State job? Why? What was it about his performance at Oregon State that led to him becoming one of the most sought-after head coaching candidates in the country? Well, it was his run game. It was his offense. He made DJ Uiagalelei into an extremely productive college player. He made Damian Martinez into an outrageously productive running back at the college level. He had a run scheme that was extremely difficult to defend. But guess what? It didn't happen last year. Like I said, 110th in the nation in rushing. I happen to think, though, that Jonathan Smith and his offensive coordinator, Brian Lindgren, are going to figure that out this offseason. I also look at Aiden Childs and their quarterback and the struggle, I guess, for lack of a better word, the struggle that he had to go through as a first-year starting quarterback. It was hard. He was thrust into the lineup, made a lot of mistakes, had a bunch of really high-quality learning experiences last year. And hopefully this season we'll have a better understanding of what he can get away with, and he's probably not going to take as many risks with the football, turn the ball over way too much. The good news is they did find a star potentially in the sophomore wide receiver Nick Marsh, but they got to cut down on penalties. They got to cut down on turnovers, and they have to figure out a way to be more consistent running the football. If Michigan State can do all those things, look out. They can be a real problem for some of the Big Ten contenders in 2025. Let's go to another giant killer for this upcoming season. That's Rutgers. We will keep it in the Big Ten. Now, Rutgers last year, they won 4 Big Ten games, and that's the first time that Rutgers has ever won 4 games in the Big Ten. Remember, they joined the league over 10 years ago. That was in 2014. And they've never had an in-conference performance like they had last year. You look at what they bring back. They bring back a lot on the offensive side of the football. Ethan Kaliakmanis, he's back as their starting quarterback. He's got 30 career starts. They have a chance, I think, to kind of open up the passing game because they went out and they got some quality pieces in the transfer portal, pieces that you might be able to rely on pretty well, and I think you should feel pretty good about. Offensively, I think they're going to be all right. Now, they're going to have to find capable replacement in the run game, sure. Running back departures are significant, but some of the continuity that was created last year can carry over this upcoming season. One thing that I'm super bullish on are the 2 pass rushers that they added in the transfer portal, and Eric O'Neill and Bradley Weaver. O'Neill was the first team all Sun Belt, had 13 sacks for James Madison last year. And then Weaver was second team all MAC at Ohio. He had 8.5 sacks and 3 forced fumbles. If those 2 guys can click and all of a sudden Rutgers has a super dynamic edge presence on both sides, look out, man. That could be a big issue for Big Ten teams in obvious passing situations. So I think Rutgers, very dangerous team this season that not enough people are talking about. Team number 3 that we are putting into the giant killer category, that's Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati last year, and really the last couple of years, had pretty disappointing seasons, right? But if you look at some of the pieces that are back, they're in a pretty good spot. They have a solid offensive foundation centering around their quarterback, Brennan Sorsby. He had a really nice 2024 season. He's now back, and he'll be the centerpiece of what they want to be on that side of the ball. Will they be able to replace Corey Kiner, their running back? That'll be tough. He went for over 1,150 yards last year, so replacing his productivity might be a challenge, but I think it's Cincinnati, and they've got to have good backs. I think they're going to be all right in that position. And then if you look at their defense, they are really experienced kind of across the board. They bring back some of their top tacklers, including Jake Galday, and including defensive tackle Dante Corleone, who is one of the best defensive tackles in the Big 12. He's going to be a huge problem. And then they've now added 15 portal additions as well. This could be a team that at 5-7 last year, they lost their last 5 games. At 5-7 last year, when you watched them, they felt better than their final record would indicate. They just made way too many mistakes. If they can flip the script a little bit, it would not surprise me whatsoever if Cincinnati's back into the 7-8 win type of realm, and a team that could be a huge giant killer for one of the Big 12 teams with title hopes. Another team in the Big 12 that was disappointing last year, but might be poised for a big bounce back is Kansas. Now, Kansas, their quarterback, Jalen Daniels, 33 starts, but he's missed a bunch of time. He missed 14 starts in 2022 and then 2023, but did start all 12 last year. He finally figured things out, and the team in general kind of figured things out in November. They lost so many one-score games, had so many self-inflicted mistakes, that in the first 2 months of the season, it was just really ugly and almost borderline painful. It was just constant heartbreak after constant heartbreak, week to week to week, with some of the games they were losing. But guess what? You fast forward to November, and they won 3 straight games against ranked opponents. If they can carry over where they finished up to where they could be going this upcoming year, they could be in a really good spot. They do have to replace their outstanding running back, Devin Neal, who went for nearly 1,300 yards, was one of the best rushing attacks in the Big 12 last year. With Neal gone, they're going to have to go with longtime backup Daniel Highshaw, but they've always been pretty good at the running back spot. You add in Daniels' legs at quarterback and the Iowa transfer LaShawn Williams, and they should be in a pretty good spot at the running back position for Kansas to make some noise there in the Big 12. And then finally, our giant killer. And you'll notice too, with all of our giant killers, these teams have kind of always been giant killers, haven't they? I mean, Michigan State has always seemingly knocked some teams off. Kansas, at least the last handful of years, has always been a team which is not a team you wanted to play. Cincinnati, they made a living being a giant killer for a very long time before they became a championship contender, then went back to becoming a giant killer again, has made the playoffs as an underdog in the past. And then finally, NC State. Now, NC State went into last year with massive expectations, and it just never materialized. They went in, they said, we're going to go all in on the portal. They brought in a ton of guys, and it didn't work out. As a result, Dave Doran kind of looked at the chemistry of his team and realized this is not NC State football. This is not recognizable from what we've been in the past as far as culture and continuity. Going out and getting all these guys in a transfer situation, man, all it takes is one guy that doesn't get in line, and now all of a sudden you have fractures in the locker room, and the amount of effort that we're seeing just wasn't consistent enough from NC State last year. I happen to think that year is going to be the anomaly. When we would look back at Dave Doran's tenure there in Raleigh, it's success after success after success after success. Now, they have not always played great with expectations. But when no one's talking about them, NC State's a huge issue, and they might be this year because guess what? No one's talking about them. They have a bunch of pieces back, most specifically C.J. Bailey, who at times last year thrust into the starting role at the quarterback spot. He was a freshman, so did play like a freshman from time to time, but there were some moments in his performances where you're like, all right, this kid's got it, right? He's got it. If he can just build on that and eliminate some of the mistakes, they could be in a really good spot. And then if they could figure things out defensively, because that last year's group kind of fell off a cliff based on what the expectation has traditionally been for the Wolfpack, and I happen to think they'll be back in the mix this year as a possible contender there in the middle to upper tier of the ACC. I think last year was the blemish. I think there's going to be a big bounce back for the Wolfpack there in Raleigh. Moving over to the other side of the triangle, let's talk a little North Carolina. They've been one of the hot topics of the offseason. Bill Belichick, 6-time Super Bowl champion, arguably the greatest professional coach in the history of the NFL. If you agree with that, fine. If you don't agree with that, that's fine as well. Just saying he's arguably in the mix. He is now coaching in college football, and at 73 years old, here he is, leading a program that has long been considered an underachiever, but one that has the highest possible ceiling in the ACC. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but now it appears as if there's alignment in Chapel Hill for the very first time. But it will require some adjustments from Bill Belichick. He's only ever dealt with pros. And now dealing with college kids, even though we've morphed a little bit more towards becoming professional in how our sport settles things out, it's still college kids, and their overall grasp and understanding isn't necessarily always what you're going to get with true professionals. Here's Bill Belichick from his press conference on March 5th about the adjustment he's having to make.
Similar to like what a rookie mini camp would be and time with the rookies. Granted, those kids are a little bit older, but they're coming from all different programs and different situations. And so, it's starting to put everything together. Here's how we do things. Here's what our expectations are. This is what you need to do to be successful, and they've embraced that. They've tried to do it. Again, we have a long way to go. We haven't accomplished anything, but we're a lot further along than we were five weeks ago, and the players are ready to practice and ready to learn and embrace a new program. So, getting there.
Now, there was a lot of buzz about UNC actually going through a Hard Knocks, if you will. HBO has long popularized that amazing series that's been going on for 20 years and has provided us just so much content, so much behind the scenes. And as someone that played in the NFL for a handful of years, I'm really happy that I was never part of Hard Knocks, okay? It just seemed like a distraction. As a bottom of the roster guy, a guy that had to fight every single fall camp for a job, I didn't want to have to do interviews when I really needed to get in the cold tub or the hot tub or whatever it needed to be to give myself a slight edge, all right? So that is beside the point. But I look at Hard Knocks, and this deal has now fallen through. They're not going to do it. I think this is really beneficial for UNC. The last thing North Carolina needs to do at this point is to become a sideshow. And people will look at that word and they'll say, well, why are you being so negative? No, I'm not. I just think North Carolina is taking major steps toward trying to create a legitimately national championship competitive football program. Like they have the resources to do it. Now, the commitment has not always been there because football in Chapel Hill has always taken the back seat to what the basketball team needs to be. Understandable. That's where they've had most of their success is in hoops. But it doesn't mean that football can't coexist. And knowing how valid football is for the future of college athletics, they had to lean in. They had no choice but to lean in. They go out, they hire the splashiest coach we've seen in college football history, arguably. And now they have an NIL collective that is as competitive as anyone in the ACC. The big key, though, is whether or not these new players that Bill Belichick has gone out and tried to attract, he's brought in 46 new players. That's an outrageously large amount. That is tied for the fourth most in the FBS. So he has completely flipped the roster. What will they be? I think a lot of it hinges on who their quarterback's going to be. Right now, they have two guys that will be going through spring. Max Johnson is still there. He had a bad injury in the first game of the season last year. He's still there, but is still rehabbing, so won't be a huge factor in the spring, but likely will be as time moves a little bit forward. So they have two guys that they're considering at the moment. One is Purdue transfer Ryan Brown, and the other is freshman Bryce Baker. And it will be very interesting to see how this is all going to play out. Now, if they're playing for the future, it feels like Bryce Baker's the obvious choice. If they're playing for the present, you'd probably stick around and think that Max Johnson is the guy that can best bridge the gap between where they're at currently and where Bryce Baker, the hotshot recruit, will likely take them. This will be really interesting. If you look at their schedule too, they do have a schedule. They have Clemson at home. They don't have Miami on the schedule, but there's a bunch of tricky ones on there for North Carolina in an ACC that I think should be significantly improved this upcoming year. I'm fascinated to see how Bill Belichick's going to work, man. I am. I'll be the first to admit, much like Dion, much like Belichick, the splashier the story, the more I'm going to support it. In my line of work, we get paid on clicks and viewership. All right. When Bill Belichick takes North Carolina from obscurity to relevance, that's a good story and one that everyone can gravitate towards. Just like with Dion, when Dion took over at Colorado, no one ever talked about Colorado prior to Prime's arrival. He's arrived. We now talk about him as often as we can. Why? Because people are interested. Same can be said for North Carolina. So I will be watching this group very closely. Want to have a great feel for what their roster could be. And can Bill Belichick carry over the momentum that's been created this offseason into spring and then hopefully into fall? But it'll be fascinating nonetheless because North Carolina, based on what happened in the ACC last week, might have some pretty big opportunities coming up in the next 5, 6, 7 years. Speaking of the ACC, Florida State, and Clemson have finally reached a revenue distribution settlement. Now, for those of you that have not been paying attention, Florida State and the ACC and Clemson and the ACC, they've basically been in a four-way lawsuit where ACC has countersued Florida State and Clemson and Florida State are suing the ACC to try to challenge their grant of rights so that they can get out and go to a different conference, what have you. So that's been going on for a while now. But we have now finally reached a settlement. And this is a really good thing for the near term of the ACC. Now, the grant of rights for the ACC remains intact. That's the first takeaway that you need to understand when looking at this settlement. The grant of rights means that the Florida State Seminoles and the Clemson Tigers and everybody else, their rights are still owned by the Atlantic Coast Conference through 2036. But starting next year, that would be 2026, their exit fee will go from a couple $100 million now down to $165. And then from $165 million, that fee declines by $18 million per year. And then it levels out in the calendar year of 2030 and 2031, and it levels out at $75 million. That means that in 2030, 2031, any ACC team, if they want to write a check for $75 million, they are free and clear. They will then own their own media rights. They will have the right to shop their media rights. And if they want to, at that time, go into another conference, they will be able to do that, assuming they can write that $75 million check. Now, right now, they have to pay, if they were to leave before June of 36, it'd be pretty significant, right? So a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, okay? The timing of this exit is very intriguing. The Big Ten's rights are up in 2029, 2030. The Big 12 is up in 2030. And the next college football playoff negotiation will be up in 2031. So that is all going to be kind of figured out before these other ACC schools can jump into the pool and figure out what they might be worth as well. Now, in addition to the exit penalty reduction, that's just a small piece of what's gone down with the settlement. The ACC is officially introducing a new, quote, brand initiative that will give additional revenue to the ACC schools that do the best on television. So the higher the television ratings are in the games that you participate in, the more likely you are to get more money from the ACC, which is really impressive. And I think that's part of why Clemson and Florida State have cooled on pursuing other avenues, because Clemson and Florida State are going to be among the highest rated television programs in the ACC. Those programs are going to do great on TV, especially if Clemson's as good as I think they're going to be. And if Florida State can somehow revert back to the quality that we saw from them in 2023. Now, this is big because now the projections are about $120 million in new revenue over the next 6 years to the ACC's brand initiative. It's about $20 million annually that could go to the highest levels of the ACC school, which would close the gap considerably between the Big Ten, the SEC, and the ACC, which right now the gap is massive, but that extra $20 million a year would be really valuable for those schools that would have the leverage to go elsewhere if they got out of the ACC. That's big. You also look at the bottom of the ACC. In order to pay that $20 million annually to the top dogs, it's going to cost about $7 million to the schools at the bottom. But administrators from the bottom have said that that's an acceptable loss because the trade-off, because of this settlement, is the stability that it offers all the member institutions. Long story short, I just gave you the facts of what went down. Let's now get into the opinions. Do I think this will work? Absolutely not. Not in the long term. I think it's good right now to calm the waters and to create a little bit of an even playing field with your contenders and the top teams in the top conferences. It's great here in the next 2 or 3 years. But 5-6 years from now, it sounds right now, yeah, $7 million loss is an acceptable loss. Well, when you start having to cut programs and all of a sudden you're no longer competitive because over the next 6 years, you've lost I don't know, in the vicinity of $40+ million because you're a bottom feeder in the ACC, that's a huge problem. We have seen this model fail before. This happened in the Big 12. Remember when Texas went in there and said, hey, this is what we want. We're going to go to the Pac-12 unless you give us uneven revenue distribution. We want the rights to launch the Longhorn Network, all these other things. Texas did this in the Big 12, and what did that lead to? It led to Texas A&M and Missouri leaving the league to join the SEC. Once the SEC got both Missouri and Texas in their footprint, their numbers and their revenues went up considerably. They launched the SEC network. It became must-see TV. So Texas's greed led to teams leaving, which led to a propping up of a league that was at one point very competitive with the Big 12. I don't think this is going to work long term. Now, is this good if you're Clemson? Is this good if you're Florida State? Sure, absolutely. But how good is this for Virginia? How good is this for North Carolina? Are those two programs who might not have the same viewership as Clemson and Florida State? North Carolina and Virginia might not have the same viewership. But guess what North Carolina and Virginia have? They have the ultimate leverage when it comes to leaving the ACC. So, yes, you calm the waters with the Tigers and the Seminoles, but now do you potentially take money out of Virginia, out of their bottom line? Because I don't think that'd be a very good play long term, because guess what? If Virginia decides to write a check in 2030 to leave the ACC, you know who's going to want them? Same can be said for North Carolina. If North Carolina starts taking a loss because Clemson and Florida State get more, North Carolina starts taking a little bit of a loss, that's great. But guess what? When North Carolina writes that $75 million check in 6 years, everybody's going to want them too. The teams with the most leverage in possible conference realignment are not Clemson and Florida State. It's North Carolina and Virginia. Why? Because North Carolina and Virginia are bordering states to the Southeastern Conference, and it would be continuous as the SEC has made it a priority so that if they expand, they want bordering states. They don't want a coast-to-coast conference. But if they can keep in line and keep all their states connected, they can achieve this. North Carolina, Virginia would be very attractive to the Southeastern Conference if they were available. But guess what? The Big Ten also wants North Carolina and Virginia. Why? Because they're outstanding academic institutions, and they align culturally with what the Big Ten has been in the past. So it'll be interesting. It's great that we have now solved today's problem. That's amazing. But I think when we fast forward to 2030, we're going to have more problems as a result of this settlement than we did going in. We always appreciate those of you that have been continuing to send in great questions. We have the smartest listening audience, and it really shows by how thoughtful your questions are. So we picked some of our favorites from this past couple weeks. Continue to submit these questions, by the way. Send it to us on our social media. That's probably the best place to send them, at AlwaysCFB. Just follow us on there. You can follow me at Greg McElroy. Submit questions there. You can also submit them in the ESPN YouTube comment section. So if you submit a question there, that will also be put in our mailbag as well, and we'll try to get to that question, if it's a good one, at an episode here in the future. Let's kick things off with Mark Kubiak, who's going to take us to Ohio.
All right, first one comes from Jim in Ohio, and he asks, with college football continuing to evolve each year, do you see a time in the near future where schedules will be made just a year in advance instead of 6 to 10 years in advance?
That would be the best thing for college football. I have been saying this for years and years and years. We need to create one body that we already kind of have it, by the way. College football playoff is, and all different conferences, including Notre Dame, everybody, when they sit down and meet and talk about the future of the sport, there's 11 people in that room from every conference and from Notre Dame. We should do this for the regular season as well. I think it's an easy thing to solve because right now, for instance, if you're trying to make a schedule, let's say you're Baylor. Let's go back to 2014. This was 10 years ago. Baylor was making their schedule back in 2004 for the 2014 season. Guess what? Baylor in 2004 was atrocious. The worst Power 5 program in America. They barely ever won games. And the reason why I know that is because I was a recruit and was getting recruited by Baylor and was like, yeah, no, we're good. Because they didn't win. Well, they now have a schedule for 2014 that they made 8 or 9 years prior when they're just desperate to win 3 or 4 games. And then in 2014, all of a sudden they're a college football playoff contender. And their non-conference was a joke. And that's ultimately why they didn't make the playoff, because their non-conference was so weak and it was held against teams like Ohio State, who played Virginia Tech in the non-conference. Ohio State gets in, Baylor gets bumped out. The rest is history. So I think it'd be really valuable for us to schedule marquee matchups 1 year in advance, and for us to have a third party that is scheduling to make college football more compelling in the non-conference. It'd be great. I'd like to see a model personally where every conference played 9 conference games, and then your 3 non-conference games were reserved to play against either regional group of 5 opponents or comparable Power 5 opponents. So if you finish 4th in the ACC, you can play the 4th best team in the SEC, the 4th best team in the Big Ten. And then if you want to play, let's just say you're North Carolina, you want to play East Carolina, great. That's regionally an important game to be played for that state. So I think we could totally revamp the scheduling model and make it way better, but it's going to require athletic directors to relinquish power. And we don't anticipate that happening anytime soon.
All right, that's fair. Staying in the schedule theme here, Tim in Texas. He asks, out of the P4, who is a sleeper team that has a beneficial schedule similar to Indiana and SMU last year?
Well, I looked through this a little bit. I didn't spend as much time as I'd like to because this will be a topic in future dates. Who's this year's Indiana? We're absolutely going to have that conversation. We just need a few position battles to kind of iron out before we can get into that. That's a summer topic, so keep it locked in here on Always College Football. But a few schedules that I looked at quickly, I think Illinois has got a really favorable schedule. I also think Illinois has got a lot of pieces back, which is why I think if I had to put a college football playoff projection, if I had to put one out right now, Illinois would be on the short list of kind of sleeper teams that I think could really make it in. I really believe that. Their schedule's manageable. They got a lot of good home matchups. They do have a couple tricky ones, but for the most part, Illinois would be one. I think Michigan's schedule is pretty manageable this year. There's a handful of teams in the ACC, but I don't think the ACC is going to be given the benefit of the doubt the same way the Big Ten was. The reason why Indiana made the college football playoff last year is because they were 11-1 in the Big Ten. If you're 11-1 in the Big 12, will you make it in? If you don't win the conference, probably not. Maybe you will, but probably not. So kind of need to dive in, but that's a good question, one that we will absolutely revisit a couple months down the road.
All right, next one comes from Mike in Syracuse, and he wants to know, Syracuse just put up a 10-win season last year, but they lost Kyle McCord and have a really difficult schedule with Tennessee and Notre Dame in the out-of-conference games. What do you think is a realistic win total for Syracuse in 2025?
Well, Syracuse's win total in Vegas is 7. I lean just ever so slightly towards the under there. I know it's not going to be popular up there with our good friends in Central New York, but I look at the departure of Kyle McCord, and that's one small piece of the puzzle. You also lose Aronde Gadsden, your outstanding wide receiver. You also lose LaQuint Allen, your number 1 tailback. There's a lot of pieces that are off of last year's team. You lose Jackson Meeks. You lose a handful of other pieces that are going to be tough to replace. Now, the main thing is who replaces Kyle McCord. And at this point, I don't know with certainty that Jakari Williams, who's the most experienced guy, was originally committed to Georgia Tech, very athletic guy, flipped to Syracuse, chose them over NC State and Pitt. I don't know if Jakari Williams, I don't know what he can be. I haven't seen enough of him to know for sure that, all right, yes, he is a guy that we can rely on heavily in the passing attack because last year's group, Kyle McCord threw for 4,700 yards. Well, Jakari Williams seems to be at this point a guy that's crazy athletic that makes a lot of plays with his legs. I also look at Ricky Collins. They brought him over from LSU, kind of newer to the system, was the backup last year to Garrett Nussmeier, also very athletic, hasn't played a ton, just 4 games in the last 2 years, and has thrown 7 career passes. I haven't seen anything from those 7 passes that make me think he's going to adequately replace a guy that threw for nearly 5,000 yards. So I think the offense is going to look very, very different. So it's hard for me at this point to totally get behind Syracuse, knowing the schedule's way tougher and there are massive holes on their opposite side.
All right, last one comes from Mike in Mississippi. And simply, he wants to know who will have the best defense in the SEC.
Well, statistically speaking, last year, Texas was the best. They gave up just over 283 yards a game. They bring back some really high-level players. Probably the most star-studded defense in the SEC next year with Trey Moore and Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill, Ethan Burke. This is a really good defense when it comes to household names. But there's also a bunch of pieces that they lost. All right. They lost a bunch of really good players at defensive tackle, had to go to the portal. That's now 2 years in a row in which they've lost really quality pieces on the interior of their defense. They also lost a couple of great players in the back end. Jade Barron was one of the best in the country last year in creating plays out at corner. He's now going to be gone, but he could slide inside. He could do a lot for you and was a great leader as well. So I think Texas might have the highest ceiling, but there's also some unknowns. Based on S&P Plus projections, that's Bill Connolly, when measuring returning production, Texas A&M actually brings back the most production. But when I think about A&M and I think about the pieces that I watched leave off of last year's roster, man, how are they going to replace Shamar Stewart, Shamar Turner, and Nick Scorton? I'm not sure they can. Now, did they go and do a pretty good job in the portal? Yeah, I like some of the guys they brought in. Julian Humphrey from Georgia in as a starting corner, plug and play. Deion Hayes coming over from Pitt. He's got some twitch off the edge. So they brought some guys in, but those 3 that I referenced, Shamar Stewart, Shamar Turner, and Nick Scorton, those were game changers. I mean, take over the game guys that will be very, very tough to replicate their presence on a down and down out basis. I look at Tennessee. They were second last year in the SEC as far as total yards given up. They just lost way too much up front defensively. You also take into account that Ricky Gibson, their corner's transferring. Jermon McCoy is a torn ACL. I don't feel confident whatsoever right now in Tennessee being anywhere near what they were last year. I love their scheme. I think Tim Banks, their defense coordinator, is amazing, but their personnel is way too big of a question mark for me to think that they're going to be at the top of the conversation. Ole Miss and South Carolina, both at the top of the SEC as far as rankings last year. Ole Miss lost a ton. South Carolina lost a ton. And while they bring back Dylan Stewart on the edge, they still have to replace 6 or 7 fifth-year seniors on the defensive side that all could play at a high level and play at a consistent level from start to finish of a football game. The last one that I kind of considered is Alabama. They lost 2 really high-level contributors off last year's defense. One was Jahad Campbell. The other was Malachi Moore. Pretty much everybody else is back. The big question with Alabama is how deep are they? I think everybody that looks at their starting 11 or even the top 15 guys or so that will be in the rotation, I think those 15 guys can play with anybody. They're really, really good. Those top 12, 13, 14, 15 guys. But when you start thinking about defense and the best defenses in the country, they're playing as many as 26, 27, 28 guys in some cases. And in all likelihood, you're going to have 2 or 3 that you lose to injury at some point in the season. Notre Dame last year lost 6 to injury, and yet the drop-off defensively didn't happen until the final game of the season. So all that being said, it'll be very interesting to see how Alabama does because I like the coaching continuity. I like the personnel additions that they made defensively, and I like that a lot of their best players last year were freshmen and sophomores and are now going to be taking a step this year. Second year in the system, I expect a pretty big bump. So Alabama's the wild card when it comes to the best defense in the SEC next year. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Encourage all of you to continue liking, rating, and subscribing. We really appreciate all the support that you've shown us over the years, and we look forward to continuing to give you great content on a week-to-week basis. Like I said, go and download the podcast wherever you get the podcast. If you're not subscribed, do it. It helps us. It helps the show. Your engagement with the show helps the show, and you've helped us grow to numbers that we never thought were possible in the first 2 or 3 years. So we very much appreciate all the support that you guys have shown us. Tell your friends about what we're doing here. We'll be back next week, talk a little bit more about some of the news and notes, and start setting the table for some of the big storylines heading into spring football. So for all of us here at ACF, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.